The bus doors hissed open, and Sarah Mitchell stepped onto the cracked pavement of Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Dust swirled around her sneakers as she clutched a single duffel bag that held everything she owned. The September sun beat down mercilessly, but it was the emptiness that struck her first. Miles of golden prairie stretched in every direction, broken only by scattered homes and the distant silhouette of the Badlands. She had come here to disappear, to escape the wreckage of her former life in Chicago, where her marriage had crumbled, her job had vanished, and her sister had died in a car accident, all within 6 brutal months. Sarah had found the teaching position online at 3 a.m. during one of her sleepless nights. Pine Ridge Reservation needed an art teacher. No experience required, just a willingness to show up. She had nothing left to lose, so she applied. Now, standing in the heart of Lakota country, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The wind carried unfamiliar sounds and the air tasted different here, mineral and ancient. A truck pulled up beside her, its engine rattling like bones in a jar. The driver, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked black hair, leaned out the window. "You must be the new teacher. I'm Agnes. Get in before you bake out here." Sarah threw her bag in the back and climbed into the passenger seat. Agnes drove without speaking for several minutes, navigating dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere. Finally, she spoke. "People come here for 2 reasons. They're running from something or they're looking for something. Which one are you?" Sarah stared out the window. "Both, I think." Agnes nodded. "Then you came to the right place. This land has a way of showing you what you need to see, even when you don't want to look." They arrived at a small trailer that would serve as Sarah's home. It was modest but clean, with a view of endless sky. Agnes helped her carry her bag inside. "School starts Monday. The kids here have been through more than most adults. They'll test you. But if you're genuine, they'll know. Lakota children can sense authenticity like animals sense weather." That first night, Sarah lay awake listening to coyotes howl in the distance. She thought about her sister Emma, who would have loved this wild landscape. Emma had always been the brave one, the one who believed in fresh starts and second chances. Sarah had been the practical one, the planner, the person who colored inside the lines. But all her careful planning had meant nothing when life decided to demolish everything she had built. She woke before dawn to watch the sunrise paint the prairie in shades of orange and pink. Something about the vastness made her feel small in a way that was almost comforting. In Chicago, her grief had felt enormous, suffocating. Here, it was just one more thing carried by the wind. She made coffee and sat on the trailer's metal steps, watching the world wake up. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals with effortless grace. Monday arrived faster than she expected. The school was a low-slung building that had seen better decades. Sarah walked into her classroom and found 15 students waiting, their eyes sharp and evaluating. She had prepared a speech about art and creativity, but the words died in her throat. These kids didn't need platitudes. They needed someone real. So instead, she picked up a piece of charcoal and drew a single line on the board. "This is where we start," she said. "Everything begins with one mark. One choice to create something from nothing." A boy in the back row, maybe 14 years old, watched her with unusual intensity. His name was Thomas, she would learn later. He had eyes that seemed older than his years, and when their gazes met, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that they both carried wounds that hadn't healed. 3 weeks into her tenure at Pine Ridge, Sarah had settled into a rhythm. Wake before sunrise, coffee on the steps, drive to school in the battered Honda she had bought from Agnes for $800. The students had stopped testing her after she spent an entire class period painting alongside them in complete silence, showing rather than telling. But it was Thomas who captivated her attention, though she tried to hide it. He came to class early and left late. While other students chatted and laughed, Thomas worked with fierce concentration, creating images that disturbed and amazed her. He painted thunderstorms that seemed to move on the paper, portraits of elders whose eyes followed you across the room, and abstract pieces that somehow captured the feeling of loneliness better than any photograph could. His talent was raw and undeniable, but it was the sadness embedded in every brushstroke that made Sarah's chest tighten. She had learned not to ask questions directly on the reservation. Information came when it was ready, usually from unexpected sources. Agnes told her about Thomas over coffee one Saturday morning. His mother died when he was 7. Drug overdose. His father is in prison in Sioux Falls for assault. Thomas lives with his grandmother, Mary Broken Rope, but she's sick. Diabetes took her feet last year. The boy raises himself mostly. Cooks, cleans, manages her medications. His carrying the weight of the world, that one. Sarah understood weight. She had been carrying her own version since Chicago, and it threatened to crush her some days. The reservation had its own gravity of sorrow. Everywhere she looked, she saw the evidence of historical trauma, systemic neglect, and ongoing struggles. Poverty wasn't just an economic condition here, it was woven into the landscape like barbed wire into fence posts. Yet there was also tremendous beauty. The way elders told stories, making the past feel alive. The sound of drums at community gatherings. The fierce pride people took in their language and traditions despite everything trying to erase them. One afternoon, she found Thomas sitting alone near the baseball field, staring at the horizon. She approached carefully, as she would a wild animal. "Mind if I sit?" He shrugged, which she took as permission. They sat in silence for several minutes before he spoke. "Why did you come here? Teachers don't usually stay." His voice was deeper than she expected, already transitioning toward manhood. Sarah chose her words carefully. "I lost some people. Important people. I needed to be somewhere different, somewhere that didn't remind me of what I'd lost." Thomas nodded slowly. "My mom used to say that grief is like carrying stones. Every loss is another rock in your pocket. Eventually, you get so heavy you can't walk anymore." The metaphor struck Sarah like a physical blow. It was exactly right. "What do you do with the stones?" she asked. Thomas picked up a pebble and turned it over in his palm. "I don't know yet. I'm still collecting them." He stood up and walked away before she could respond, leaving her sitting there with tears streaming down her face. She hadn't cried since arriving in South Dakota. She had been too numb, too determined to hold herself together. But something about this boy's quiet suffering had cracked her open. That night, Sarah drove out to the Badlands and hiked to an overlook she had discovered. The landscape was alien and beautiful, all sharp ridges and exposed layers of earth showing millions of years of geological history. She thought about stones and grief and the weight of carrying loss. She thought about her sister Emma, who had died because a drunk driver ran a red light. She thought about her ex-husband, who had left because he couldn't handle her sadness. She thought about the job she had loved and lost when her company downsized. Then she thought about Thomas, a 14-year-old boy painting his pain onto canvas because he had no other way to release it. She wondered what stones he carried and whether art was enough to lighten the load. The stars emerged as the sun set, more stars than she had ever seen in her life. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. In Chicago, you could barely see a dozen stars through the light pollution. Here, the universe revealed itself in full glory. Sarah made a decision that night. She would stay. Not just for a year or until something better came along, but truly stay. She would plant roots in this difficult, beautiful place. She would show up for these students, especially Thomas, the same way she wished someone had shown up for her when her world fell apart. She didn't know if she could save anyone, but maybe she could witness their struggles and let them know they weren't alone. October brought cold rain that turned the dirt roads to mud. Sarah's Honda struggled through the ruts, fishtailing and sliding. The reservation looked even more desolate under gray skies, the poverty more stark without sunlight to soften it. She arrived at school to find Thomas missing from class. It was the first time he had been absent, and worry gnawed at her throughout the day. After school, she asked Agnes about Thomas. The older woman's expression darkened. "Mary's in the hospital. Kidney failure. They took her to Rapid City yesterday. Thomas is likely at the house alone, or maybe at the hospital. That boy shouldn't be by himself right now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She got directions to the Broken Rope home and drove there immediately, her heart pounding. The house was a small structure with peeling paint and a collapsing porch. Sarah knocked, but no one answered. She tried the door and found it unlocked, which Agnes had told her was common on the reservation. Inside, the house was tidy despite its shabbiness. Someone had worked hard to keep it clean. She found Thomas in a back bedroom, sitting on the floor surrounded by paintings. He looked up when she entered, and she saw that he had been crying. "She's dying," he said flatly. "The doctors say maybe a week. They asked if I have other family, but there's no one else. My aunt lives in Denver, but she hasn't called in 3 years. Social services is going to come. They'll put me in a group home or foster care somewhere." His voice cracked on the last words. Sarah sat down on the floor beside him, ignoring the voice in her head that said she was crossing professional boundaries. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I'm so sorry." The words felt inadequate, like trying to hold back a flood with a paper cup. Thomas wiped his eyes roughly with his sleeve. "Everyone leaves. My dad left. My mom left. Now grandmother is leaving too. Maybe I'm the problem. Maybe I'm what drives people away. The pain in his voice was unbearable. Sarah shook her head firmly. No. Listen to me. You are not the problem. You've been dealt a harder hand than most people face in their entire lives, and you're still standing. You still come to school. You still create art. You still take care of your grandmother. That's not weakness, Thomas. That's strength. He looked at her with those two old eyes. Then why does it feel like I'm drowning? They sat together until darkness fell. Thomas showed her his paintings, each one a window into his interior world. There were pieces about his mother, her face rendered in loving detail despite years having passed since her death. There were paintings of his grandmother, strong and whole, the way he wanted to remember her. There were self-portraits that showed him fracturing, coming apart at the seams. The talent was staggering, but it was the emotion that made Sarah's throat tight. These need to be seen, she said. This work is too powerful to hide in a bedroom. Would you let me organize an exhibition? We could show these at the school, maybe even in Rapid City. Thomas looked skeptical. Who wants to see a kid's paintings? Sarah met his gaze. Everyone. Because these aren't just a kid's paintings. These are human documents. They tell the truth about grief and survival. People need to see them. Over the next week, Sarah threw herself into organizing an exhibition. She recruited Agnes and other community members. She contacted galleries in Rapid City and sent photographs of Thomas's work. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A gallery owner named Patricia Winters called her personally. I've been in this business for 30 years, Patricia said. I've seen thousands of artists. This boy is exceptional. I want to show his work. I'll cover all the costs. Sarah visited Thomas at the hospital where he was keeping vigil beside his grandmother's bed. Mary Broken Rope was small and frail, kept alive by machines that beeped and hummed. But her eyes were still sharp when Sarah entered. You're the teacher, Mary said, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas talks about you. Says you understand. Sarah didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. Mary beckoned her closer. Take care of him when I'm gone. His special, that boy. Not just the painting. His heart. He feels everything so deeply. The world will try to break him, but don't let it. Promise me. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I promise. Mary closed her eyes, satisfied. Thomas held his grandmother's hand, and Sarah sat with them both, bearing witness to love and impending loss. Mary Broken Rope died 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning when frost covered the prairie. Thomas called Sarah, and she rushed to the hospital. She held him while he sobbed, this boy who had tried so hard to be strong. His body shook with the force of his grief, and she remembered her own breaking point after Emma died. The moment when she had finally surrendered to the pain and let it consume her. It's okay to fall apart, she whispered. You don't have to carry this alone. And for the first time since arriving in South Dakota, Sarah understood why she had come to this place. Not to hide from her own grief, but to learn how to carry it alongside others. To transform pain into connection instead of isolation. The wake for Mary Broken Rope was held in the community center, a building that smelled of sage and coffee. People came from across the reservation to pay respects. Sarah learned that Mary had been a respected elder, a keeper of stories and traditions. Thomas sat stoically through the ceremony, accepting condolences with quiet dignity that broke Sarah's heart. He had dressed in his best clothes, a button-down shirt that was slightly too small and jeans without holes. Agnes had braided his hair in the traditional way. The Lakota approach to death was different from what Sarah had known in Chicago. There was sadness, yes, but also celebration of a life well lived. People told stories about Mary, laughing at memories of her sharp wit and generous spirit. They spoke in a mixture of English and Lakota, and even though Sarah couldn't understand all the words, she felt the love in the room. Thomas participated in the ceremonies, helping to smudge with sage, accepting the condolences of elders who embraced him with genuine affection. After the wake, Sarah drove Thomas back to the empty house. Social services had agreed to let him stay there temporarily while they figured out placement options. Sarah had been making calls, trying to find alternatives to foster care. She had even considered offering to take him in herself, though she knew the system would never allow a single woman with no relation to become his guardian. The unfairness of it enraged her. The exhibition is this weekend, she said as they sat in her car outside his house. I know the timing is terrible, but Patricia wants to go forward with it. She thinks your work could attract serious attention. Maybe even scholarship opportunities. Thomas stared at his hands. I don't know if I can do it. Stand there while people look at my pain like it's entertainment. Sarah chose her words carefully. It's not entertainment. It's testimony. You're telling the truth about what it means to survive loss. That's not weakness, Thomas. That's courage. And your grandmother would be proud. He looked at her then, and she saw the lost child beneath the stoic exterior. Will you be there? At the exhibition? Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. I'll be right beside you the whole time. I promise. The gallery in Rapid City was a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls and track lighting. Patricia had done an incredible job displaying Thomas's work. Each painting was professionally framed and lit, transforming the raw emotion of the pieces into something transcendent. Sarah arrived early to help with final preparations, her stomach churning with nerves. This felt enormously important, like they were standing on the edge of something that could change Thomas's life. Thomas arrived wearing a borrowed suit jacket that Agnes had found for him. He looked terrified and young and heartbreakingly vulnerable. Sarah stayed close as people began to filter in. The crowd was larger than she had expected. Local artists, collectors, teachers, and community members from Pine Ridge who had driven the hour to support one of their own. The room buzzed with conversation. Patricia gave a brief introduction, explaining how she had discovered Thomas's work and why she felt compelled to show it. Then she invited Thomas to say a few words. He walked to the front of the room, his hands shaking. Sarah held her breath. I paint because I don't have words for what I feel, Thomas began, his voice quiet but steady. My grandmother used to say that art is prayer. That when we create something, we're talking to the spirits, to our ancestors, to the parts of ourselves we don't understand. These paintings are my prayers. For my mother. For my grandmother. For everyone on the reservation who carries more than they should have to carry. The room was absolutely silent. Thomas continued. I'm Lakota. That means I come from people who survived things that should have destroyed them. Genocide, forced relocation, boarding schools, poverty, all of it. But we're still here. Still speaking our language, still practicing our ceremonies, still raising our children to be proud of who they are. These paintings are about loss, but they're also about survival. That's what I want people to see. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People crowded around him, asking questions, praising his work, exchanging contact information. Sarah watched from the side, tears streaming down her face. Patricia appeared beside her. He's going to be fine, she said. I've already had 3 serious inquiries about purchasing pieces, and a professor from the Institute of American Indian Arts called. They want to offer him a full scholarship when he graduates high school. This boy has a future, Sarah. Thanks to you. Sarah shook her head. Not thanks to me. I just gave him a space to be seen. The talent and courage were already there. But privately, she felt a fierce pride that surprised her with its intensity. She had come to Pine Ridge broken and lost, expecting nothing but a place to hide. Instead, she had found purpose. She had found a way to transform her own grief into something useful. By witnessing Thomas's pain, she had learned how to hold her own. The evening wound down, and Sarah drove Thomas back to the reservation. They didn't talk much during the drive, both exhausted from the emotional intensity of the night. As they approached Pine Ridge, Thomas finally spoke. Thank you. For everything. For seeing me. Most people look right through kids like me, like we're invisible. Sarah's throat tightened. You were never invisible to me, Thomas. From the first day, I saw exactly who you are. Someone remarkable. Winter arrived with brutal force, bringing temperatures that made the prairie feel like another planet. Sarah's trailer was poorly insulated, and she wore layers of clothing even indoors. The school struggled to keep the heat running consistently. Students came to class in heavy coats they never removed. But something had shifted after the exhibition. Thomas had gained confidence, walking taller, speaking more. Other students had started taking the art program more seriously, inspired by seeing one of their own succeed. The social services situation had reached a crisis point. They wanted to move Thomas to a foster home in Pierre, 3 hours away. He would have to change schools, leave behind everything familiar. Sarah had been fighting the decision, making calls, writing letters, enlisting Agnes and other community members to advocate for keeping him on the reservation. But the system was indifferent to what Thomas wanted or needed. They saw only a minor without adequate guardianship. 2 weeks before Christmas, Sarah received devastating news. The placement in Pierre was approved. Thomas would leave after the holiday break. She drove to his house to tell him, dreading the conversation. She found him painting in the cold house, his breath visible in the air. He was working on a new piece, a landscape of the Badlands in winter. It was beautiful and desolate. "They're sending you to Pierre," she said without preamble. Thomas's brush stilled. He didn't turn around. "I know. The social worker called yesterday." His voice was empty, defeated. Sarah moved closer. "I'm going to keep fighting this. There has to be a way to keep you here, near your community." Thomas finally turned to face her, and she saw that he had been crying. "Why are you doing this? Why do you care so much?" The question hung between them. Sarah sank down onto the worn couch, suddenly exhausted. "Because you remind me of myself. Not the circumstances, but the feeling of being alone with your grief, thinking no one understands. After my sister died, I felt like I was screaming and no one could hear me. I walked through the world like a ghost. I came here to Pine Ridge because I was running away from pain. But then I met you, and I realized that running doesn't work. The only way through grief is to face it, to let someone witness it with you." Thomas sat down beside her. "Your sister died?" Sarah nodded, and for the first time since arriving in South Dakota, she told the whole story. The car accident. The call that came at 2 a.m. The funeral where she had been too numb to cry. The slow dissolution of her marriage because her husband couldn't handle her depression. The loss of her job. The complete collapse of everything she had built. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he reached over and took her hand. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said quietly. "But I'm glad you came here. You saved me, you know. Before you arrived, I was thinking about ending it. I had pills saved up from my grandmother's medications. I was just waiting for the right moment. But then you showed up and saw something in me worth saving. You made me believe I had a future." Sarah's heart stopped. She had known Thomas was struggling, but she hadn't realized how close to the edge he had been. "Thomas." He squeezed her hand. "I'm okay now. I'm not going to do that. Because you taught me that grief doesn't have to destroy you. It can change you, make you deeper, more compassionate. You taught me that by example." They sat together in the cold house, two people who had found each other across a chasm of loss. Sarah made a decision in that moment. She called Agnes, then Patricia from the gallery, then every contact she had made since arriving in South Dakota. She worked the phone like a lawyer arguing a case. She documented Thomas's exceptional talent, his ties to the community, the trauma that relocation would cause. She got letters from tribal elders, from teachers, from the gallery owner. She became a warrior fighting for this boy's right to stay home. On the day before Christmas, a miracle happened. Social services called to say they had found a solution. A distant cousin of Mary Broken Rope, a woman named Carol who lived on the reservation, had agreed to become Thomas's guardian. Carol was vetted and approved. Thomas could stay. When Sarah told him, he broke down completely, sobbing in her arms like the child he still was beneath all his strength. "You did it," he kept saying. "You kept your promise." The school year continued, and Thomas thrived. His work continued to gain recognition. He was invited to show at galleries across South Dakota and beyond. College recruiters came to Pine Ridge specifically to meet him. But more important than the external success was the internal healing. Sarah watched him laugh with friends, paint with joy instead of just pain, plan for a future he now believed he would have. Spring came late to the prairie, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape overnight. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible abundance, carpeting the ground in purple and yellow. Sarah and Thomas took a field trip with the art class to paint the spring prairie. They set up easels on a hillside overlooking miles of rolling grassland. The students worked quietly, absorbed in capturing the beauty around them. Thomas approached Sarah as she painted her own canvas. "I've been thinking about what you said. About grief being something we carry together instead of alone. I want to start a program at the school. An art therapy group for kids who've lost someone. A place where they can express what they are feeling without having to explain or justify it." Sarah smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "That's a beautiful idea. I'll help you however I can." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Sarah reflected on the year that had passed. She had come to Pine Ridge empty and broken, convinced she had nothing left to give. Instead, she had discovered that healing wasn't a solitary journey. It happened in the spaces between people, in moments of connection and witnessed pain. She had kept her promise to Mary Broken Rope. She had taken care of Thomas, but in the process, he had taken care of her too. Thomas stood on the hillside, his face turned toward the setting sun, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that he would be okay. He would carry his stones of grief, yes, but he wouldn't carry them alone. She would walk beside him, and together they would prove that love could survive loss, that community could heal wounds, and that sometimes the people we're meant to save end up saving us instead. Her tears had fallen on Lakota soil, and true to the bond they had forged, he had never let her cry alone.